So we added validators. I did mention that we would also build our own custom validator, and that is indeed what I'll do now. Because thankfully, that's really straightforward, especially when working with reactive forms. When it comes to template-driven forms, adding your own validator is a bit more complex because you need to build your own validation directive and register it with Angular, and also implement certain features Angular expects from validation directives. That's why you might not end up building custom validators for template-driven forms too often, especially since Angular ships with many built-in validators which cover all common use cases. But if you ever need to build your own validator directives, or if you want to do that, attached you find a link to the official Angular documentation where you can learn how to create such a validation directive. It's not super complex, just a bit more complex than building validators for reactive forms, as you will see here. Because a validator for a reactive form, let's say for this password form input here, is in the end just a function. A function which will automatically get that control as an input, and a function that should then return null or nothing if the control is considered to be valid from this validator's point of view, or return anything else, for example, an object with details about the error if it's considered invalid. Now here I'll actually outsource this into a separate standalone function, which I'll store in this same file though. You could also put it into a separate file, but to keep things together, I'll keep it in this file here. And I'll name this function must contain question mark, because here I want to build a simple dummy validator function that ensures that my password contains at least one question mark character. So, as mentioned, we'll get a control as an input here, and that will be a so-called abstract control, which is a type that must be imported from Angular forms. So that's the kind of value we get as an input. And then here I want to check if control.value contains a question mark. And we can do this pretty easily with this JavaScript code. If that's the case, I'll return null. And that will tell Angular that this control is valid, at least from this validator's point of view. But alternatively, I'll return an object where I'll have a property which I'll name does not contain question mark, which I'll set to true. You can structure this object however you want. That's just a common convention, that you have some kind of descriptive error code which is set to true. So now with that, this function is finished, though that should be includes, not contains. Includes is the right one. I always mess these two up. But includes is a built-in method built into JavaScript, which can be called on strings to check whether a string includes a certain character. And with that, this validation function is now finished, and we can now go down to our password control and add it here to this validators array. I'm not executing it here. Instead, I'm just passing it as a pointer to this function, to this array, because Angular will execute these validator functions for us. Min_length was executed because that's actually a factory function that produces the validator function. That's a pattern you can use if you have a validator function that needs some configuration, like the minimum length for which it should check. But that's not the case for our custom validator function here. And with that all, if we now go back to our form, I can enter a valid email. But if I now enter a super long password, which does not include a question mark though, I get an error. And we probably should clarify the error message here to make it clear that we need a question mark. Because as soon as I add one here, this error goes away. And that's therefore how we can build and register our own validator. Now I'll just quickly go to the login component and update this error message and say must be at least 6 characters long and contain a question mark. Like this. But with that, this is now finished. Now, besides regular validator functions, you can also register async validators. And an async validator is in the end also just a function that gets a control as an input, but it's then a function that must return an observable. And this allows you to do things like send an HTTP request to a backend to check whether an email address already was registered there or not, for example. In the end, the observable should then yield null if the input is considered valid, or an error object as we did it here if it's considered invalid, for example. So, to quickly show you how you could create such an async validator function, I'll add one here. And it'll just be a dummy validator function that's not actually useful here, but that shows you how you would create one. Because here I'll just add one that checks if email is unique. And for that, I'll get my control, which is of type abstract control. And I'll then check if control.value is equal to test@example.com, let's say. If that's the case, I consider the email to not be unique, because let's say that's already a registered email address. Though, of course, in reality, you would not hard code this here, but instead, as mentioned, send an HTTP request to the backend. But here, for demo purposes, I'll hard code it, and if this condition is met, the input is therefore considered to be invalid. So here I would return my object that contains the error code. Or to be precise, I would return an observable that in the end emits that object. Now, to be in line with the structure of my first validator, to make things not more confusing than necessary, I'll actually check for the opposite here. So that here I want to return null, but still, we don't return null. Instead, we return an observable that emits null. We can do this by using the auth function, which can be imported from RxJS. Because auth produces an observable that instantly emits a value. In this case, null. And if we make it past this if check, I know that I have an invalid value, so then I'll return an observable with help of auth that will emit such an error object. And here I'll give this an error key of not unique and set this to true. And this is now an async validator. We can now use this email is unique function here and register this as an async validator, though not here for the password, but instead here for the email. With that, if I save that all, and I go back, you'll see that if I enter an email that's equal to test@example.com, I get an error, even though it's a valid email address, because it's now not unique, according to this dummy demo async validator. If I enter anything but test@example.com, for example, test2@example.com, the error goes away. And that's therefore how you can set up async validators. Here it's a simple example, but of course you can perform any asynchronous logic you want to perform in there.